start at a high level, what do you, from a sort of AI marketing, content generation, all this, what are the legal implications of all this?
Yeah, so in terms of legal implications, maybe I'll kind of break it down into the kind of regulatory landscape, then looking at some specific issues around kind of data use, and then IP actually. So in terms of the regulatory landscape, and you kind of touched on this a little bit when you were sort of saying, do regulators know what they're doing? Can they catch up? And there is this kind of misconception that actually there is no regulation around AI, and that's actually not the case. There are some existing laws. Everyone would have heard of the GDPR. That actually has a specific, some specific rules about using certain types of AI systems that create automated decisions. So things like, loan applications where someone makes a decision automatically around whether someone gets credit or not. That is already regulated under the GDPR. There's something also called the Equalities Act that, people talk about AI discrimination and bias. So that aspect of AI is already regulated in terms of the Equalities Act. But we've got a brand new piece of legislation, thanks to the EU. They're always very enthusiastic in terms of regulating technology. So there's something called the EU AI Act. Some of you might have heard about it. It's coming into force in about less than 2 years' time. And that essentially categorizes AI systems into prohibited AI. So certain types of AI are going to be completely banned. There's high-risk AI, which will be subject to quite burdensome requirements around ultimately how you use it. And there's going to be kind of low-risk AI, which is things like ChatGPT. So in the high-risk category, it will be things like credit scoring, anything you use in the employment context, anything around profiling, which will be relevant to sort of marketing and advertising. The UK has decided not to follow the route of the EU. Same with the US, actually. They're following a very similar path. And the UK is really trying to differentiate itself in a post-Brexit world, so trying to be seen as very kind of business-friendly. So we've got this kind of non-statutory or non-legal model that we're following. So we've got a set of principles that people developing using AI need to follow. Very super high level. But what the UK will do is it will require regulators to take those principles and apply them to kind of regulatory guidance and regulatory rules. So if you're operating in a regulated industry within your marketing department, or maybe your clients are, so financial services, health, communications with Ofcom, then those regulations will be relevant to what you do if you're using AI. I mentioned about GDPR. There is this concept of automated decision-making. A good example, as I said, is with sort of credit applications, or maybe you're using it in the context of deciding whether you want to see CVs from an employment perspective. That essentially, if there is no human involved in that process, in that decision, may well require consent. So that's one way in which AI is regulated. And then lastly, in relation to AI, there's two aspects, IP, sorry. There's two aspects to this. So inputs and outputs. So inputs are things like data that's used to train algorithms and systems. So, AI systems require a huge amount of data actually to make them kind of really work. And you've seen a lot of cases at the moment. Getty in particular have been quite active because certain AI systems have been using images to train algorithms. Dow Jones, all the kind of content industry, authors, where their data has been used to train algorithms. In essence, you can't really use that data without the permission of the IP owner. And the reality is most AI platforms have been scraping publicly available information for a long time to train their AI. So there's been a lot of litigation around that, and that's going to continue. The other issue around IP and AI is in terms of outputs. There's a huge question mark in terms of who owns outputs from AI generated works. That question isn't really kind of settled, but that's something you need to bear in mind when you're, you know, creating content.
And I suppose as a marketer and marketeers or agencies in the world, that's what we've been using AI for, is that whole, right, can we write this blog faster? Can we create a new image so we don't have to go to a photo shoot? So I suppose there's a room full of marketeers and agency folk. What's the sort of implications around that?
Yeah, so I think so. So if you're in an agency model, an agency business, I think if you're, I think the kind of biggest single risk, I think, is if, you know, you've got a contract with a client, they've asked you to create some content, and ultimately then they're asking you to transfer, you know, ownership in that content, or maybe give some comfort around that it doesn't infringe IP. That's where the issue is, actually, or one of the main issues. I think when you're giving, you know, you're trying to, your client is asking for ownership of their work, or they're asking for some comfort around that work is original. And actually, if you've used some AI to generate, you know, the content or the image or whatever it might be, I think that's where you're going to, you know, potentially get into trouble.
And have we seen anybody getting into trouble yet? Is it...
I mean, there's a huge amount of litigation with IP generated content. I think we saw very recently that someone used
Was it Sienna Miller's voice?
it was Scarlett Johansson.
That's it, yeah.
And someone, I think, created some voice, some advert, some campaign, and they're using Scarlett Johansson. Well, they weren't using Scarlett Johansson's voice. Actually, the AI created a voice that sounded remarkably similar to Scarlett Johansson. And then you've got, obviously, they eventually had to stop using it. There was obviously some reputational damage as well. So that's the sort of thing, I think, where you have to be kind of mindful from a legal risk perspective. But the sort of things that you can, how you kind of mitigate some of those risks is, you know, you might not have your own in-house system. A lot of people will, you know, ultimately outsource this or buy in kind of technology. And understanding exactly what that vendor does in terms of AI is really important. You know, well, what sources of data are they using? Because there's a massive IP risk around that, and also a data risk, a GDPR risk around that. Understanding, you know, how outputs are created and ultimately who owns that, and providing that properly in the contract, I think, is important. And also how it works. So people talk about AI in a black box. Actually, often one of your legal requirements, if you're kind of engaging with users, is to be able to explain to users ultimately how the AI works. So that's really important. Explainability is a really important. Explainability and transparency is a really important legal obligation in relation to AI. And a lot of AI systems exist in a multi-vendor environment. And what I mean by that is you often have some AI technology, and it relies on third-party sources of data. It relies on hosting by someone else. It might contain components of other technology, and each layer of technology creates a security risk for cyber hackers. So understanding that environment and then making sure that vendors are you know, they have appropriate security measures in place are kind of really important, actually, from an AI perspective. I think the other thing to think about when really mitigating some of these legal risks is around human intervention. So I mentioned that's quite important from automated decision making. People talk about a human in the loop or human in control. I think that's kind of critical in terms of managing things like discrimination and bias. So making sure that someone is actually properly reviewing the outputs. I've seen first-hand experience in terms of hallucination. So from a legal perspective, we've seen AI. Someone wrote a brief, a legal brief that they actually submitted to court using AI, and the AI system they use completely made up a case. So I've seen it when I've used AI, and it's kind of fabricated that it read a document that I know it hadn't read because I hadn't given it to read. So hallucination is a real risk. And so having some form of human intervention, I think, is really important to mitigate this risk. And similarly, I think if you're using AI to create copy or content or materials, the sort of process that you would typically go through where it gets screened for IP infringement, it gets screened for, if it's advertising copy, it gets screened for whether it's misleading or not, that it's truthful and it's honest, and you verify your sources. You have to adopt the same approach in relation to AI generated content. So you shouldn't treat it any differently from the way you human created content. So having a really robust approval process, I think, is really important. And then ultimately, it's very boring, but having that all contained in a policy that people understand, this is how you use AI, this is how you use it safely, and this is how you use it to mitigate risk, is really, really crucial. And then ultimately having some training on that to reinforce the policy. So having a situation where, people are just kind of, it's great to experiment, but that needs to be in a controlled environment, a kind of sandbox, if you like. But where you're starting to use it in, client outputs or external outputs, I think then that does require, some safeguards in place, that to be contained in a policy, and ultimately people to have training.
And are you seeing now companies have a policy, don't have a policy? Is that like a thing? They're asking you to help them write a policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the sort of work we're doing at the moment. The other thing we're seeing actually is some of our clients are now looking to draft like addendums or contracts that are dealing with specific AI risks. So they're being very clear about what they want their providers to do in terms of AI. So things like, confidentiality is key. They don't want, sensitive information being uploaded to ChatGPT. Ultimately, I mentioned about IP ownership, sharing information, etc. So we're getting very specific requirements put into contracts with, vendors, whether it be agencies or the like, around, ultimately how they use AI in the provision of services to their clients. So that's one of the kind of trends that we're seeing at the moment.
I'm just conscious of time. If you want to ask Colvin any questions, can we ask them in the coffee break? Is that all right? We're a bit behind. Right, so just quickly to wrap up, what do you think the future holds with all of this? Where are we going?
So more regulation, not less. So I think ultimately the UK will end up following the EU approach. I think the US is the same as well. I think that's the only way you can do it. There's a bit of cooperation already at an international level, because this is a principle that applies across borders, and the only way you can regulate it actually is at an international level. The EU is already going to pass some more law called I think it's the EU AI Liability Act, which will make it easier for individuals to essentially sue companies that use AI, and ultimately there's some harm caused from that. We see that already with the GDPR. Actually, every time I have a client suffers a data breach, and we tell individuals, almost immediately there are 50 lawsuits coming our way, all quite small level, but you've got these kind of privacy class action lawyers, low cost, high volume. We're going to see the same with AI, where that causes some harm to people. Maybe it's made a decision that has caused them some difficulty, or maybe there's some discrimination, some bias, and more litigation in terms of data use and IP infringement. Interestingly, I was telling someone earlier, I've just done a deal recently with one of our publishing clients. They've just licensed their entire back catalogue of science journals to a massive tech provider for an 8-figure sum in order to train its algorithms. That is quite new, actually, because a lot of people were just, as I said, using publicly available data, which has certain risks. So we're starting to see more licensing from a data perspective, so you get more accurate and better algorithms. So that's the sort of trend we're seeing a little bit. Less relevant maybe to people in this room, but that is an overall trend where the tech providers are looking to ensure that their algorithms are just much more accurate and much more effective.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much, Colvin. Round of applause for Colvin.